Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're going to completely shatter your image of a peaceful forest utopia. You know, when we imagine wild chimpanzees, we usually picture a pretty tranquil scene, right? Eating, playing, grooming, just generally looking out for their community. But today, we are uncovering a much darker reality about our closest animal relatives. We're going to look at what happens when a united community fractures, when old friendships dissolve, and when animal politics turn incredibly violent.
To really ground this story, we need to think about this number right here, 98%. We share roughly 98% of our DNA with chimpanzees, and because of that intense biological closeness, their social lives are deeply, deeply relevant to us. You see, they don't just exist in some basic survival mode. Their communities are remarkably complicated. They experience real friendships, bitter rivalries, intense competition for status, and massive struggles over territory. Chimpanzees have this deep social intelligence. They know exactly who is powerful, who can be trusted, and who is connected to whom. And as you'll see, that intelligence becomes a literal, lethal weapon when conflict arises.
Part 1. A peaceful world turns violent. This entire story is anchored in the groundbreaking work of primatologist Jane Goodall. Back in the 1970s, at Tanzania's Gombe Stream National Park, Goodall observed a unified group of wild chimpanzees fundamentally fracture. The once united society basically split into two distinct competing factions. You have the Kasakela community, which was the larger group, and the Kahama community, the smaller splinter group. Now, at first, this just looked like a simple territorial separation, nothing too crazy. But this division caused lifelong friendships to completely disappear overnight, setting the stage for very dangerous, rising tensions between these two rival camps.
Part 2. The Gombe-Chimpanzee War.
What started as a seemingly peaceful separation gradually escalated into a coordinated, multi-year conflict, something researchers literally dubbed the Gombe-Chimpanzee War. So how exactly does a chimpanzee war play out? Well, step 1, as we just saw, was dividing into factions, but step 2 is where it gets genuinely chilling. The males of the larger Kasakela group began forming what researchers call patrols. Small groups of males would move in complete silence through the forest along the borders of their territory, specifically hunting for members of the neighboring Kahama group. Which brings us to step 3. Isolate and attack. When a patrol found a lone, isolated chimpanzee, they would surround the victim. The attacks were brutal, often resulting in severe injury or death, before the patrol would just melt quietly back into the forest.
The absolute crux of this behavior is captured perfectly in this quote. They rarely wanted a fair fight. They wanted an advantage. These attacks, they were not random acts of animalistic rage or some sudden burst of anger. They were highly calculated. The chimpanzees were using a strategy that, honestly, humans have used throughout our entire military history. They were attacking only when the odds were heavily in their favor. They wanted overwhelming numerical superiority to ensure they won the encounter without taking any casualties themselves.
Part 3. Why do chimpanzees fight?
So why would an animal risk its own life to cross a border and brutalize its former friends? Well, the answer comes down to stark biological payoffs. First up, territory. Gaining more territory directly equals more food. When a group has more food, it can obviously support a larger population. Then we have females. Controlling territory heavily influences access to females, which is the ultimate driver of reproductive success. And finally, power. The group that loses territory loses its resources and its future, while the winning group gains absolute social dominance. So they aren't just fighting out of anger. There is a very tangible evolutionary reward for their violence.
Part 4. The power of alliances.
But you know, brute force and sheer numbers are really only half the story here. The reality relies on the surprisingly complex politics of chimpanzee society. Because just being the biggest or the strongest simply isn't enough. You need friends. And that means you need alliances. These are relationships built through hours of grooming, supporting each other in daily confrontations, and cooperating against rivals to rise up in the social hierarchy. A lone chimpanzee is incredibly vulnerable. But a group of allied males who know exactly when to cooperate and trust each other, they become a highly coordinated, incredibly dangerous force. These alliances are the political engine that makes those silent, lethal patrols possible in the first place.
Now, given the title of this explainer, The Chimp That Started a War, we really have to ask the obvious question directly. Did one specific chimpanzee just wake up one morning, rally the troops, and single-handedly decide to start this multi-year conflict? Was there a single warmonger pulling all the strings?
The short answer is no. Nature is way more complicated than that. Actually, there wasn't a single chimpanzee who just declared war. Instead, this violence emerged entirely organically. It was the result of systemic social divisions, mounting territorial pressures, complex alliance building, and the snowball effect of repeated attacks over time. The Gombe conflict teaches us that warfare doesn't just come from one aggressively angry individual. It emerges from the incredibly complex dynamics of an entire social group.
Part 5. What it means for us.
Now, scientists definitely debate how closely we can compare chimp violence to human warfare. Obviously, chimpanzees don't have governments, they don't wear military uniforms, and they certainly don't give political speeches. But their behavior, the forming of alliances, defending borders, and conducting strategic patrols, it is eerily familiar. It brilliantly illustrates the ultimate paradox of chimpanzee society, a paradox that strongly mirrors our own. On one hand, you have deep cooperation, friendship, and peace. On the other hand, you have fierce competition, rivalry, and violence. The most shocking part of the Gombe War isn't even just the violence itself. It's that the exact same animals that spend hours gently grooming each other and playing with infants are completely capable of organizing themselves into lethal, tactical raiding parties.
Which leaves us with this final, pretty profound question to consider. How deep into our evolutionary past do the borders and conflicts of our own social lives trace back? Look, chimpanzees aren't just little humans, but studying them reveals that the basic building blocks of conflict, things like loyalty, revenge, territory, and politics, well, they existed long before humans ever built armies or drew lines on a map. Our closest relatives show us just how beautifully complex, and sometimes devastatingly violent, social life can be. Thanks for joining me on this explainer. I hope this leaves you looking at both nature and perhaps ourselves just a little bit differently.